I am your host for this room and the moderator of some of these panels. My name is Jason Yee. I'm a staff technical evangelist at Datadog. And for this session, we're going to be talking about democratizing observability. Basically, how do we spread what I think you all hold as a priority and have a passion about, monitoring things, getting visibility. But how do you feel maybe like you're not the only person in your org that feels that way? So with that said, we've got some amazing panelists joining us today. So just to my left is Leslie Cordero, who's a staff software engineer at the New York Times. Leslie has worked in education technology, including at Google for Education and a bunch of ed tech startups. So she's going to provide us some of her insight from that. Next to her is Ross Banfield. Ross is the VP of monitoring at Citizens Bank. He is passionate about improving performance, not only for technical systems and understanding how they work, but for cars. He's a gearhead, and you can often find him racing his Shelby GT350 out on the racetrack. So pretty cool stuff. And last but certainly not least, we've got Rebecca Jones from Sharpen. Rebecca is the manager of cloud operations there, where she gets things running on the cloud, but she's also been known to spend time in the security operations center and network operations center. She says she loves chaos and incident management. Although I noted that from that, you didn't say you loved being on call, which is distinctly two different things. So yeah, with that, kick it off just to pose a question to the group. How do you think about observability now? Like, what are the things that you hold important for your team, and how do you set those priorities?
I guess it's more about the KPIs, like your performance indicators. You want to make sure there's no blind spots, so everyone kind of has an equal background. Because if you have, like for example, you turn on APM on just like one server, and there's like 20 servers in an application, you're not going to get the full visibility. So you got to make sure it's like conformed and sliced and diced in a way that easily breaks down things. And also being able to empower teams, because not everyone's a specialist in metrics or with Datadog or with any other monitoring tool. So being able to break it down into a format that they can easily understand and then use as a template so that they can roll out faster helps a lot.
I think it's also important to know change management and the communication for change management. So you know how the application should perform, and then especially after how it should perform.
Yeah, for me, I think of it as also a technical problem, but also as like a more social, like people problem. So maybe some of you are familiar with socio-technical systems. I think Liz Fine-Jones coined that term. But yeah, so that's the approach I come from when I think about observability or engineering in general, but like we're talking about observability. So I think to your point that having the support structures for folks who want to use observability tools, but also more importantly, understand the data and like use that knowledge to actually help them debug production systems. So I think like sort of getting more to the theme of data democratization, right? We think about that in terms of like or observability democratization, which I just kind of gave away what I was about to say, which is like, ultimately observability is a lot about just being like a data problem. And so I think similar sort of themes can be applied where we think about, data democratization as like an ongoing and continuous process. So those are some TLDRs of how I approach it.
I think there were two themes in there that I thought were interesting. One was simplifying things that Ross said with templates, and then the other being education. I'm curious, as you've worked and you've done this, like, let's start with the templates. How do you actually make things easier? What do you put in there? I think one of the problems that I've always found challenging is you make a template and then you encounter a team that's like, this doesn't work for me. These aren't the things that are important to me, or at least they tell you that. Talk to me, how do you build templates that are generally acceptable?
Yeah, so for example, I created some baseline monitors because we are in the midst of migrating 300 apps as a sole monitoring team. We can't be the bottleneck for those guys. In the past, we used to do a one-to-one mapping to monitor to ServiceNow ticket, so that led to over 30,000 custom event lookups. You can imagine every time you go to create a new monitor, you have to create a lookup in ServiceNow, and that wouldn't scale. So what we did was leverage tags, which is something that Datadog is really strong with. And we did an assignment group tag assigned to the host. So whenever the ServiceNow ticket fires, it reads that ticket, sees the value of the tag, and then that's where it goes. So all of a sudden, now when you use the ServiceNow hook, it just dynamically populates. The same thing with email. Hard coding monitors is a horrible idea because when you change it, all of a sudden now you have to go back and do like 50 monitors. So we use the team's DL in a support tag, and then use the host.support like variable. So at time of the alert, it'll fill it in and then automatically send that email out to the team. And so what we did with the baseline monitors is, granted you follow those tags, you will get CPU, disk, memory, and EC2 status check alerts right out of the gate. Kind of like a last bastion as like the check engine light saying, you know, if you hadn't set up monitoring, here's an alert that your system's definitely going down. Because a lot of times teams will deploy and then they come to us after they're already in prod. We now have a PR process where we try to catch them before, but sometimes things have to happen, dates have to be met.
Yeah, I think that question gets to a point where it's like you have to reconcile like driving consistency and making things easy, and with the like reality of like you need flexibility, which I think gets way harder as you like have more services. You're growing as a company, right? The distributed systems are kind of hellish, right? So you know, there's an art to that that's like very hard to figure out and like requires a lot of organizational context. And yeah, but like as a general strategy, right? Like driving consistency and observability, I think is like pretty crucial, especially when you're all working and you're working together, right? Like ultimately, other people's services are your dependencies, right? So.
That's really interesting because we had a similar problem at Sharpen. We didn't use any tags. Everything was custom per the service. And then you were just flooded with alerts, and they didn't know what to do with those alerts because they didn't have any standard operating procedures for them. So just adding those tags really simplified everything. And then we were able to discover that we were totally underutilizing a lot of our applications. And so we got to make those tinier.
Yeah, exactly. And like when you do start getting those tags, it makes it a lot easier to slice and dice, especially for dashboards. Like you have an incident management team and you want to like look at you have an incident. If you have like 10 different environment tags, like you have prod, PR, PRD, P, and then like how are they supposed to know which one to go to if they have 4,000 hosts? You know, the app team doesn't know right off the top of their head. They're just learning tags. So if you start doing tag enforcement or like tag aliasing, or you can write custom scripts with the API to look for the tag and say if it equals P, like change it to prod using the user tags. You can like clean that up and then give incident management a guarantee saying if you select prod, it'll be prod, everything prod no matter the tag, QA, and dev. And then that really helps simplify things for like the other team members that maybe don't know how to just navigate Datadog or any of the caveats that come with it.
Yeah, who wants to get an alert for prod?
Yeah, I think the other part of this, I think we've talked about like, what do you do when you have a bunch of services and technology that aren't already tagged and whatnot, and like going back and reconciling all that, but also like making sure that new services are well supported, so that you're not like accumulating what is basically tech debt as you're doing these like old, essentially like migrations or, you know. And so that's been something that we've been thinking about at the Times, where we have a lot of, you know, I mean, the Times is like 170 years old, and obviously they haven't had technology for that long, but like, you know, they've been doing this for a while, and so, you know, but best practices were non-existent, right? And so we have a lot of like old technology that we have to reconcile with like the new like services that are always spinning up.
Oh yeah, that's definitely, I think, a common thing for a lot of people, especially when you get into like banking or finance. You have a lot of systems that are old being migrated, but they have different priorities. Some of them will be tier ones, platinum resiliency, and other ones will be kind of left to die in the vine when the replacement comes in. So like with those dynamic alerting like I'm talking about, you can put like a tier tag, like a tier 1, 2, and 3, and you can use conditionals to say if it's, you know, environment prod and tier 1, you know, raise the ticket level to like a P1. And if it's like a bronze, you know, tier 3 app and it's, you know, not going anywhere anytime soon and it's dev, like don't raise a ticket, just send out an email.
So I'm curious along with that, is that, like with the tagging, is that something that you define or is that something that you're letting teams actually define?
So we give a little bit of flexibility, but we have like a Confluence for like cloud tagging, like the standards. You can do whatever tags you want outside of that, but we need like a 10 list, because we have finance needs something to track, so they need like a custom ID for each app. Then you have your environment tag. Well, we need to keep those values consistent, right? Then we have the application name, so it's friendly. So if you get a ServiceNow ticket that's rogue, you don't have to look at an Excel sheet to match the ID. So it's like a friendly name. And then you have your assignment group for ServiceNow and the email contact, your support. So once they have those, they're kind of free to go and do what they want if they think they can find more meaning with a different tag.
Have you found that that leads to an explosion of like cardinality or other issues of like people having collision with tagging names if people are randomly just choosing their own tags?
Yeah, so in the past, that was one of the biggest issues we ran into, was trying to whack-a-mole and chase down those teams to correct it. And so what we did when we do Terraform is we have a pre-check, and it won't let you deploy the code unless you use the pre-approved tags, and it does bounce the error. And now there's a lot of governance. The whole thing about observability is it's like kind of like a team effort. You have to explain to them why they need it, and then once they see the value in it, the ball rolls.
Very cool. I guess that leads to the other question though, right? Is like, you mentioned it's all in the Terraform. How many folks out there are using Terraform for their monitoring? Yeah, that's a good chunk. Like, I think that's the thing we're moving to, but also then I encounter teams that are like, we're developers, we don't do Terraform because that's like infrastructure or DevOps. Like, how have you, I guess, with democratizing observability, bridged that gap, right? To get people to start to use Terraform or getting them in there?
Yeah, part of it is like, so in my last job, we had this problem. Like there was like a very small set of people who were really comfortable with Terraform. And it was very hard to get them to like gain that skill set. But at the same time, we ended up kind of realizing like, why are we? Like infrastructure as code is like a thing now. So I wasn't there to finish it off, but we started to think about and migrate towards thinking about Pulumi or we thought mostly about Pulumi. I believe Terraform has their own version of that, but yes. So yeah, I think and I think that was a great way of bridging the gap, right? They know they're developers, so they know code, and that's the language, no pun intended, that they speak. So that was one of the biggest strategies we were heading towards.
I think it also depends on your organization, because it depends on how you run. Like in our example, we had to come to a very hard decision because of the way Terraform operates fundamentally. Once you go to do it programmatically to Datadog for creating monitors, you can't go to the console anymore because it will mess up the diff. And when I tried working with engineers for about 6 months to try and come up with a solution, and we couldn't because it ended up just cloning monitors every time it would find a difference. And so we had to go the path of least evil, and you've got to think with these teams, especially if they barely understand the UI, how are they going to translate that into a programmatic call in Terraform and also not possibly mess up anyone else's with elevated access? So instead, we just put some guardrails in and gave them the tools and said, you can also do it programmatically through the API if you want to go that route. But we give them the flexibility. We didn't just rip it away and say, hey, you have to do everything through the UI. We give them documents and say, if you want to do it, you can do it through Terraform, but you have to go and do like X, Y, and Z, and I'll give you a key that just locks it to you guys.
Nice. So they have the flexibility to basically do both, right?
Yeah.
If they're starting to get comfortable, they can do that.
Yeah, well, we had to come to that crossroad, and I think it varies by organization and their technical background. If there's only 5 of us on a monitoring team, there's no way I'm going to be able to train all these people how to translate the UI into a Terraform template, nor explain the template that will cover everything for all their needs.
Yeah, that's a good. That makes me think about the fact that usually there aren't super large, observability or platform teams, however you're structured. So we have to think about how we scale this kind of knowledge, and that was definitely a big challenge for us, which is part of why we started to move over to infra code instead of Terraform. Though we also kept Terraform around too, especially because there's some features that are available in some versus others. So that was definitely one thing that we thought about. It was definitely a challenge.
Well, that's good to hear. We're a relatively small company, so we're trying to approach to that space.
Ross, you mentioned something about, automation going awry and leading to a ton of monitors and things like that. And that made me think about, how do you deal with basically like monitoring noise, right? Like so many times we have alerts that are like basically useless, or you get an overwhelming number of alerts. I'd imagine that in rolling that out and letting people set their own, they can kind of shoot themselves in the foot and get too many alerts and too much noise.
Yeah, so that's kind of where we come in as the monitoring team. We're still like guiding them and saying, hey, just a heads up, if you run this, you're going to get like 10,000 alerts a day. And they basically sign the waiver saying we accept that. Sometimes you just gotta let them like run that for a little bit, and then usually the ones that will come to their senses come back and say, hey, can you help us like tweak this out? Sometimes they just kind of put it in. What you gotta watch out for is sometimes teams won't. They're just suffering in silence, and they're put in like a private little mailbox. And so that's why in prod we always have it create a ServiceNow ticket, because that's the one thing you really can't ignore. And when they do start getting ServiceNow tickets, if they start getting too much, like how do we tune that out? You got to think, should you convert the processes? You're looking at live processes, which can be pretty noisy. Should you convert that to a metric and then use it as an anomaly, or maybe just a downtime where you say if it's down for more than 30 minutes, then send out the alert? There's more than one way to kind of go about it and tackle it. So sometimes they just see it because they're new. They don't know all the bells and whistles and all the tools in the kit that they can do to kind of like minimize that. And what I like to do is I do have a regular audit that I do for myself to touch base with these teams to make sure there are none suffering in silence. Or I have a dashboard set up because in the events you can use the custom facets to see where it's going. So I can see like the monitor that's the most noisiest. I can see the team that's getting pinged the most in a day. And then sometimes I'll do like a little touch base and say, hey, have you guys been getting alerts? Because sometimes they don't even get the alerts in their email, because our organization doesn't allow external emails, so you have to adjust your DL first. So that's kind of like also a secondary check. It's like, are you actually getting these alerts, period? Because I see you're getting 600 emails. You should notice that.
Yeah, I think another strategy I've seen work well is like standardizing / recommending like a small set of metrics to actually alert on. And those are more your like, reactive monitors, and then having teams decide more on like what do we want our lagging indicators to be, and like not paging on those, right? Like the number, I think there's like a difference between thinking about the difference between like what do you like page on versus what you alert on. I think is super important here, because yeah, it is really nice to like get those lagging indicators, right? Because then they can be preventative if you use them correctly. So that's one thing that I think worked well in terms of like managing alert fatigue. And I think also using this as a moment to like, I guess to get organizational buy-in. No one likes to get paged that frequently, right? No one likes noise. And so I think that's been, highlighting those pain points as to like why this work matters, I think has been like super crucial for getting buy-in, both from like the engineers perspective, but also from like top down and cross-functionally, right? Like there's consequences of having bad on-call shifts. And I think highlighting both the technical and the social sort of downsides, that has been, I think, chef's kiss in terms of getting the folks to actually buy into it.
Yeah, and that's kind of like you said, a really good point too. Is you got to watch out for not just what you're alerting on, but you need to decide, should you even alert on it in general, or just keep it as a dashboard. For example, the process alerts I mentioned, if you're sending it to an email and it's like a P4, it doesn't really matter, it usually restores. You get 600 of those, but then all of a sudden out of that 600, one of them is a true P1, but it's also an email, you're going to miss it. So, because you're just going to ignore it, because you just get flooded. If you even have a phone, it's going to be buried under the notifications. So it's kind of important to also take a quick look and be like, should we even be alerting off of that? Because a lot of times teams will come with like old monitoring that they had on-prem into the cloud and say, I just want a one-to-one. But at that time, it's time to look at an audit and be like, should we still be alerting on these? Because then you look in ServiceNow and you see that thing generated like 300 tickets in one day. Even though it auto closes, it's still like just noise that you shouldn't have.
We do exactly the same thing. We do retrospectives each week to compare our alerts from the previous week and to make sure our engineers aren't getting blown up every week. Because we want our engineers to be happy and respond to the P1 alerts and not ignore the P4 that didn't come back alive. And that's reducing the noise, like everyone said up here.
Yeah, I think another thing that's done in the past is center around alerting on SLOs. That's been pretty effective because especially when you alert on burn rate, alerting on consumption, I have complicated feelings about. So yeah, I think that's been like super effective, and actually we used Datadog to start introducing SLOs, and yeah, so that's been, I think, an effective one too, right? Because it's also tied more directly to like the overall reliability story of like a service or workflow, however you set up your SLOs, and I think that's also made it easier to like think to translate to product folks, for example, like yeah, the consequence of like us not thinking about reliability more proactively is like leading to the payments workflow having a lot of downtime, and you mentioned something like that, and suddenly it's very. And now suddenly we want to prioritize, and so like I think also as engineers we have to be good about translating this to like business impact and user impact, because ultimately I think that's the common language I think of everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. The alerts are triggering for a reason, so we need to look into it and fix that problem.
So you mentioned SLOs, which is a whole nother fun topic that I like to dive into. So you're using that at the New York Times. Ross, have you rolled out SLOs?
Yeah,
Yeah.
It can be a little tricky sometimes because at the scale we're at, like I said, we have 318 app teams. Not necessarily every team's going to be the A team. Sometimes they're coming in, they're like the tier 3, just designed to keep a pulse on it. And so we're saying like, hey, what's your KPIs? And they go, we really don't know. We just have this map from 20 years ago. And so you got to look at it and be like, well, we should probably focus on the tier 1s first, the ones that actually know their stuff. And for those guys, once you show them the SLOs, they already know their targets. They set it up. They really run with it. They've done some pretty neat stuff with it. And they've been able to prove that, hey, it's not really us, it's our vendor. Because usually vendors like to hide their APIs and other things. Makes it hard to track the SLO, obviously. So when they're having issues, you can't go, hey, I want a refund.
Yeah.
But at least when you do have the outage, if you can point and say this service every time calls X, and it's that vendor, it's the dependency, when that goes down 9 times out of 10, it's them. And then you have like separate SLOs for each one of your service, and you see out of the total, it's all coming from one, and it's from that vendor. You can show the impact to leadership. And that way when leadership gets on the call, it's like, why are you guys always out? It's like, it's not really us, it's your vendor that you chose.
Rebecca, SLOs at Sharpen?
We have internal SLOs, but we do not utilize Datadog's SLOs at the moment.
I'm curious, like a big thing with SLOs that I find challenging is it's supposed to be that like overarching metric, right? Like this is the health of my service. And that often makes it difficult, I think, for teams to identify, because they're like, well, I have all these different priorities. Like, do I look at latency? Do I look at, response time, time to engagement or clicks? Like, I'm curious, out of all of you, how do you define those SLOs? Like, how are you guiding other teams into doing this, especially when they're, again, new to monitoring or they're just getting up to speed?
I guess from my side and from my point of view, we really just had to sit down and communicate with each other of what is our end service that we're providing our customers, and then bridge it from there. So we have 5 main ones right now: performance, uptime, call quality data, and then so on and so forth. But yeah, it's just communication internally and hoping that we can progress from there.
Yeah, I think for me in the past, I think it's a huge collaboration effort with product engineering, product engineering de facto, but yeah, so I think a huge collaboration there, right? Like they're going to be the folks who are experts on which workflows are the most important, which I think generally I approach SLOs less from a auth service has SLO of 99% or whatever. More from a all right, we have, it's less about the auth service and more about okay, can users log in? What's that SLO? What's the SLO for that workflow? Because again, then it makes it easier to, again, translate to business impact. And agree that you can have so many SLOs, right? For every, part of your application, but also converging on which ones are the most important.
So along with that, I guess the flip side of the SLO, right? You think about the error budget and your burn rate. And so you mentioned earlier the idea of if you're running out of error budget, right? That's the time to stop and take a look at things. That said, there's always a struggle or a tension between like, no, but we got to ship new features. How do you get other teams to adopt that and actually stop, right, and do that critical work?
Yeah, it's a great question. Error budget policies. SLOs without error budget policies are usually not effective. They just kind of end up being something that you track that's on, Datadog and never looked at, sometimes spreadsheets. And so, yeah, no, it's a great point. I think without error budget policies, I've seen this where it's like we were recording, whether we were meeting our SLOs, but it didn't action anything. And I've also seen the power of like when you do have awesome like concrete error budget policies. Google's, I worked at Google for a little bit, and they had error budget policies that were really crucial when we were when the world went remote, and I was on the G Suite for Education team. It's no longer called G Suite, but it will always be G Suite to me. Specifically I was on Google Classroom, and so when schools went remote, suddenly we were like, oh shoot, like are we gonna go down, right? Like 40 million to 130 million users in like a couple months. We had to have some form of accountability. Like how do we make sure, especially during a time where it was crucial, right? Like this wasn't a like, oh, we're down for an hour and that's fine. It was like, we're down for an hour and now like kids can't like learn. And so, I think, and I saw it be like a really, really effective, right? It was hard to, I think because Google was, more bought into this, obviously, like we didn't have to make the case for like prioritizing reliability work, but it was a great guiding force, right? Like we had, it was like code red, code yellow, and like code red means like you were not releasing features. Code yellow meant, you could start to engage in that work, right? And, I think even though, you might tell yourself like, well, that means you release your features. But at the same time, right, like in this case, like is what's more important, reliability or a new feature? Mm-hmm. And so I definitely have seen it be like a very effective force. And honestly, reliability was one of our distinguishers during that time. Minus when it was a Monday morning and New York City schools went online and, but occasional blip.
That's awesome. We do something similar where we review our release performance, and then if we had any impact from our releases, we view as how many support tickets that were created and the impact ratio of our customers. And then that will determine whether or not we need to slow down on releases for that month.
That's a really interesting metric. I don't think I've ever heard anybody do that, of releases and checking the number of tickets.
It's really important that we don't overload since we're such a small company compared to New York and you guys over here. We want to keep our engineers and we want to perform efficiently for our customers. And in order to do that and keep them happy, we want to make sure that we're not releasing bad code every week.
So as a small team then, I guess, do you think that makes it easier? Or do you feel like as a small team with people being more independent, it's made it harder for everyone to get on the same culture?
I think in the beginning, it was a little difficult to change their perspective on how we should view impact. Because developers, they want to push out their new code, they want to push out their new feature, and you're telling them to slow down, which is very hard. But using that error budget and the release performance metrics, you can really show them like, hey, you generated 40 tickets from all these customers, and now they're on high level of leaving our company. So that's just going to impact the company and impact your job.
I think the error budget policy, I kind of want to come back to that because I thought it was interesting, Leslie, that you mentioned basically a gradation, right? There's like red where it's like you have to stop, but there's this whole yellow or gray area in between. How did you define those policies? Like what did that actually look like in terms of not just saying you have to stop all new feature releases?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think negotiation with product folks especially. So, and again, like I think showing the value of that, and like I posed the question like, what's more important at this time, like having reliable services versus like being able to release features, and so I mean, I think you can't make that sort of call like independently. It has to be a cross-functional effort, and you have to think about top-down buy in there too, right? So I think, yeah, a lot of the short answer is like a lot of negotiation, a lot of like being very strategic about, how you translate the impact of, sort of neglecting non-functional requirements of architecture, and again, like translating that to the like very real impact for users. So, and then and so like at every step, right? What do we consider red versus like yellow? Is like just being very thorough about like what each of those scenarios look like.
I agree.
Ross, do you have a similar policy?
Well, for people that don't know immediately like what to determine red, maybe you should look at the downstream impacts. For example, if you have an SSO and it's having its error budgets going over, that is definitely a red. You could also, if you need to break out the stick, because the carrot and the stick model, you can have it open up a ticket automatically in ServiceNow and put it at high priority because leadership will pay attention to that. Or like a Jira ticket because they use the excuse it's not in our backlog. You can automatically add it to their backlog, and that way they can investigate it. There's creative ways to go about it, but the way I look at it, especially if all your key apps sign into that SSO, you should pay attention to the uptime of it. And you can have like two, I guess you can say SLOs, one from the application side because it can be their code or it can be on their end. So like 500 errors when they make that call goes against them versus going against the SSO. And if all of a sudden you see it's all the SSO, then you know where you need to focus.
I guess the flip side of that, right? You mentioned downstream. How do you handle things where maybe a service that you're dependent on is definitely failing, but according to their SLOs, they're not, right? But you're dependent and it's impacting you. Do you have any processes or tips for how teams collaborate together on something like that?
Yeah, I think it's easier when they are meeting their SLO, right? And then you're not. So I mean, the thing, is you have to do dependency tracking. If like AWS, if they have an SLO that's like 4 nines, you're obviously not going to get 5 nines. So just like, actually keeping track of like dependencies there too. And then, I guess I kind of keep saying negotiation, but like, delivering that feedback, telling them why is it important that we keep our SLOs, and the specific numbers we attach to it. And also I think to your point earlier, you said about like having some sort of like continuous check-in. Yes, that's also super important, right? Because like the actual experiences, how they manifest, like are a feedback loop for you to like iterate on. Like we'll make mistakes. Our initial SLOs might be like too unrealistic, right? And so it's important to like think thoughtfully about it continuously. It's hard because like you have to reconcile the like you're like like what you ideally would want, like reconciling the idealism with like the reality of your context. But obviously you can't just say I want 4 nines and just like we're gonna make it happen no matter what. You have to consider like all the factors that go into that SLO, which is it's so many. So it's not an easy process, but it's an important one.
Yeah, like for determining the SLO, I think leaving it up to the app teams, 9 times out of 10 they do it right, but there's always going to be that one team that's just difficult. And so instead you should, I would say, work together with them, but go off a baseline. So for example, we have a resiliency grid. Your platinum, you shouldn't be down within like 15 minutes being time to restore. So you can use any time it goes over that in a monitor, and then that goes against their SLO, and that's how you count it. You got to look at your SLOs. You got to use the right metrics, because if you use the wrong monitors for your SLO, it's going to be inaccurate. So you got to think about what metrics you decide to use for your SLO, and sometimes it's good to kind of audit those, or pick ones that are guaranteed that when it's triggered, it's a legitimate incident. Using a live process monitor for an SLO is not a good idea, but using like logs, like your 500 errors, anytime you have a 500 error and you have like a spike of them, and then that triggers a monitor, that counts against it until it recovers.
Very cool. So I think we've got just a few minutes left, so I wanted to kind of pose one last question for you, or offer you the opportunity. What's one tip from each of you that you would recommend for folks as they start this journey, as they're trying to broaden observability in their organizations? One thing that they can take away.
What really helped me and the companies that I've worked for is just going to each team and understanding what they do and what's the service that they have and how it impacts the platform. And then also getting them involved in like bigger discussions. Like no one's ever going to be mad at you for asking questions and trying to improve the performance of the application. And I think that really helps out.
Yeah, I think I will circle back to, I think, my first answer, which is like the socio-technical part. I think it's super important to think of it that way. Yeah, we have to build the culture of observability and reliability management in general, and I think like starting there is really hard, and again, like requires a lot of buy-in, and I think like compelling technical vision and strategy, because people are compelled by storytelling and powerful like technical vision and strategy, and like I've personally used that like as a driving force for getting buy-in, and making sure that like your organization is like incentivizing wanting to do this kind of work. I think sometimes it can feel, I think it's some of the things I think we mentioned, some of the downfalls is like, we don't want it to feel like it's punitive, right? Mm-hmm. We want it to feel like it's something that they care about and not something that it's like, oh, I gotta like just do this thing, right? Like no one feels good about that. And so, yeah, I think, thinking about it both from a technical perspective, but also from a social aspect is super crucial.
I guess my advice would be to kind of be a good foundation for these teams. Work smarter, not harder. Really leverage tags. Try to get the most out you can with the product so that the team has to do the least amount of work. And then also explain and show them the value in some of the past cases. If you have like an A team that really took it and ran, and you got another like tier 1 team coming in, show them what they can really do when you go all out with Datadog. Usually 9 times out of 10, they'll take it and run. They get excited because they're like, we didn't have this visibility before. We had, high latency and we were able to reduce it with some of the tools with Datadog. We didn't even know this existed until you showed it. That's usually what happens 9 times out of 10. They just don't know the tool exists.
Awesome. All great advice. So I want to thank you all for being on the panel and sharing your insight and experiences with us today. Thank you all for coming. Up next, we do have another panel, but I think we've got some time in between. So if you've got questions for our panelists, I think they'll be hanging out for a bit, so you can come on up and ask your questions. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the conference.